reality of black men's disposable role as a concuserve. Can you please explain that?
Well, a concuserve is basically a combination of a concubine and a serf, right? The basic idea is that the way black men are perceived in our own communities in many ways is that we are primarily there to serve several key purposes. The serf part is just the labor. You're expected to labor, you're expected to protect, you're expected to sacrifice your life to do so, so on and so forth. Your job is not necessarily to lead. Your job is to do whatever needs to be done according to her direction. But the concubine element of it has to do with stereotypes about black men that go back to slavery, right? The idea that as walking phalluses, your job is to sexually please everybody and serve as a semen repository when and if she so-called decides to get pregnant. So these kinds of objectifications of black men, we don't talk about. See, if I say objectification of black folk, most of us assume that we're talking about how women are being objectified as sex objects, but men are objectified as success objects. Men are objectified as, beings who provide resources, and that's all they do. Whether those resources are sex, whether they're sperm oriented in terms of reproduction, or whether they are sacrificing black males' bodies, even in death, right? Even in death, where we become lottery tickets to others, all of that is acceptable. Right, as long as you serve this kind of utilitarian idea that whatever your life brings is solely in the benefit of her. So in that respect, the concuserve has to do with black men who are socialized really from birth to serve women and to serve what we call the black gynocracy, which is basically what others might term it the matriarchy. But the notion of matriarchy is centered around a mother. What we have in the black community at this point is centered around the female, regardless of age. And so with that in mind, that's what we deal with.
Wow, Doc, that's so much to unpack. Can you go a little bit into the explanation of gynocracy? Because although many of us who follow the YouTube pages and what we call the manosphere, this is new to a lot of the people on my page. They just don't know. You got a bunch of people who...
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, all right. So if you look at the major areas of any community, right, those who are in control of those areas are usually those designated as leading the community, right? So whether you're talking about business, whether you're talking about the church, whether you're talking about education, whether you're talking about political representation, particularly electoral, there are key areas that you can look to see who's in a position of authority. And when you look at black men, what you find is that we're not in positions of authority. I mean, yes, if you look at the church, we often serve as symbolic role, figureheads, but the churches are predominantly women. When you look at education, black men from 1976 to 2018 literally have half the degrees of black women. Right. When you look at, business and entrepreneurship, black women have been celebrated recently as being the demographic to have the most number of businesses, and particularly in the shortest period of time. Black men are not designated as the group that's expanding in entrepreneurship. And I did a show recently about the number of the, small business grants and support mechanisms that we've seen develop since COVID. And although you'll see them on the basis of race, you'll see them on the basis of gender, and you'll see them targeted specifically to black women, you very rarely hear about any of them targeted at black men, right? So when you talk about electoral representation, right, the majority for the last 20 years, the majority of those going into politics, the overwhelming majority are black women. And this is primarily predicated on higher education. Right. So when you look at all of these areas that we designate as central institutions to any community, even the family, right, as a central institution. Well, by and large, we have the largest community in terms of female headed households. Men are not in those positions overwhelmingly so. And I'm saying this as a single black father talking to another single black father. We know this. Right. The percentages are not that we are the ones in largest number in terms of heads of household. So in all the major institutions you look at in a given community, it's not black men that are in a position of authority. Yet it's black men that get the blame when we talk about where the community is, even though black men are not in decision-making capabilities in any of these particular institutions. But that's in a nutshell, when we talk about the black gynocracy, that's what we're referring to. Right, this multi-generational configuration of the family and the heads of community that are overwhelmingly female, and female led. And yet, despite all of that, Black men are generally the ones that get the brunt of the blame for where things are in the community.
Now, Hispanic families are led by their fathers and their men. White families are led by their fathers and their men. Asian families, even Native American families. How did the Black family get led by women? And was it always like that?
Not at all. Not at all. Now, I would make the argument that you didn't never have, you never really had a pure, clean patriarchy in the Black community. But this notion of the gynocracy is something that has been developed in waves. So you could talk about various things that have happened from slavery onward, whether you're talking about slave owners designating, the women to be the heads of the particular living areas they may have lived in, and they could determine who could live there, things of that nature. But by the time you really get to World War II and beyond, when you start to see this development of a program to support poor women, right, what we call welfare actually really began with supporting widows after World War II. And by the time you get to the 60s and 70s, it morphs into something that ends up, especially in regard to the man in the house rule, being a requirement that men not be present in households in exchange for governmental federal support, right? And so with that in place, you start to see the active removal of men. But the other component to it is no-fault divorce. And with the rise of no-fault divorce in the 1970s, and I'm saying this to an attorney, you already know the impact that had on marriage, right? And so with that, marriage declines dramatically.
And if I can add on to that from a legal standpoint, what Dr. Johnson is saying is that prior to no-fault divorce, you had to have a cause of action for divorce, infidelity, some sort of something serious. You can't just say irreconcilable differences, I want to file divorce 6 weeks, and now you walk away with half the gifts and prizes that your mate earned. After the no-fault divorce went into place, women basically who were the people who earned less money were able to say, well, you know what? It financially benefits me to leave him, take half the money, plus get a monthly stipend in the form of alimony and child support, and take half of his riches. So why should I stay when I can have all the benefits and along with all the financial benefits along with my freedom? So what we did was we created an incentive for divorce to happen. So that's what no-fault divorce, and I believe it arose initially in California under Ronald Reagan, and then it just went across the country from there. But I didn't mean to cut you off. I did want to add a little tidbit.
And I think it appropriate that the attorney that we all know and love do so. But it had a huge impact. And I talk about this in alignment with a number of things that all hit at roughly the same time, the same 10 to 20 year period, right? So, as Black women in particular, if they were poor, they could get welfare, they could get state resources. If they were somewhat middle class, they could go to college. And at the same time, these avenues were being, strengthened. You had the advent of the war on drugs, and the impact of the war on drugs and on the Black community had to do with incarceration and death, particularly for Black men, right? And that begins most formally in the 1970s. So again, all of these things are happening roughly the same time period, late 60s through the early 1980s. These things are all colliding at the same time, and they're colliding in a manner that underdevelops Black men and prioritizes and elevates Black women into at least a symbolic middle-class life and a symbolic leadership position. And by symbolic, I simply mean that it's predicated on white institutional support. So if welfare is withdrawn, if college access is withdrawn, even to this day, and some of these things have been happening in some respects, it falls apart. But it is nonetheless the structure that has kind of prioritized Black women in a way that Black men can't really match. Another area would be birth control, right? Now I'm gonna ask you, as a grown Black man with sons, what birth control options are you able to talk to your sons about that have varied since the 1950s? You got condoms, you got the pull-out method,
the written method,
abstinence. You know what I mean?
The old Lord method,
right? The gamble your future method.
You don't have it. You don't have it.
Right. And this is 2020, right? but we know at least 5 major forms and 30 different types of birth control that women have. Women can literally control contraception before, during, and after the sex act itself. And that doesn't even include abortion. And there are women who use abortion as a contraceptive, so to speak, or as a form of birth control. We don't have any of those options, and it's 2020. So what I'm saying is, during that 60s, 1970s time period, Black women women in general were able to gain an incredible amount of control over their reproductive system. And outside of not having sex, you didn't. And I don't care how many people try to tell me, well, condoms are dependable. Condoms break. Condoms tear, and we're not even talking about the people that will purposely sabotage condoms for the sake of you getting them pregnant. So I'm simply saying that even reproductive control, as something men were not able to advance on, that women have a great deal of control over, had an impact on Black men's status or quality of life, so on and so forth. So when you merge reproduction, she has complete control of her reproductive system. You have very little once you decide to have sex. You link that up with a new family court policy that prioritizes mothers as the primary child giver, and what do you have? You have a dynamic that severely undermines Black men's abilities to sustain themselves. So if you got to, like you said, give up half of your income, well, if you make
plus a monthly stipend.
Plus a monthly stipend. If you make $1 billion, you may lose a great deal and be pissed about it, but you're not worried about where your next meal is coming from.
Right.
If you make $15,000 a year, that's a whole nother situation, right? Yeah. And so I can tell you, my very first day at Fresno State, when they sat me into the orientation, one of the first things they said is, as a state employee, you can lose 100% of your paycheck on back child support.
Wow.
Now, I'm not in that situation, so it wasn't something that scared me. It was just something that gave me pause, because I was like, there are people who are having 100% of their checks taken behind this. I have a stepfather who's in his 70s with cancer. He is still paying back child support on my stepbrother, who's a month younger than me. And his ex-wife has passed away in the 90s. He shines shoes for a living. He's still paying child support in 2020. So when we talk about the debilitating effects of this, it's multi-generational.
And, if I can add on to that, underneath the policy of child support, there's an incentive for the government, the states, to tax the men, because we're typically the primary earners, and we make more and we'll save more. And so if they don't actually get that money back into the stream of commerce, the economy collapses, the economy shrinks. So by giving the woman the money, forcing the money out of the men's hands, giving it to the women, women are known through social studies to spend more. And so they continue to increase the economy. So there's a benefit for the government to do that nobody seems to want to talk about.
Right.
Doc, I got a question for you, and it has to do with marriage. Now, according to my research and what I think is common knowledge at this point, up until 1965, more or less, African-American families were the most married people in the country. Is that something that you found to be true?
Yeah, up to, I believe, 80% or so we were. And this is why you see such an extreme reversal in a very short period of time. But I didn't mean to interrupt.
No. Now, as a follow-up to that question, what I find when I address Black feminists is they say things like, I just call them strong Black feminists, but they say things like, well, the only reason that Black women and men were married was because Black men were forcing them to stay married because of abuse and domestic violence. Talk to me about that. How do you address something like that? Is there any truth to that, or where does that come from?
What I recommend to people is they pick up Dr. Tommy Curry's book, The Man Not, and that'll definitely straighten you out. One of the things you'll find is that the rates of abuse, intimate partner violence, is actually higher coming out of the 1970s, higher in terms of women being the aggressors and men being the victims. Now we're in a situation where when you talk about intimate partner violence, it's bidirectional, almost nearly identical, the amount of violence going from men to women and from women to men. Yet as soon as you use the word violence or abuse, it's presumed that it's a male abusing a woman, a female, right? That's not the case. right? So in the Black community, the rates of violence have been fairly higher than others, but they're equal now as far as bidirectionality. But coming out of the 1970s and early 1980s, look at Dr. Tommy Curry's work to point out to you empirically, using documentation, not stereotype, not narratives, not a story I heard from a cousin, sister's brother. No, empirically speaking, Black men were actually victims to a greater degree than Black women. Nobody wants to talk about that.
You know, and I think when we do talk about it, it's talked about in jest. Oh, grandma threw some hot grits on grandpa because he can't.
Yes.
We know the Al Green story. We hear it. It's almost humorous when a Black person or a man in general has his anatomy removed from him forcibly by his female counterpart while he's sleeping. We think that's funny. Why is there so much humor surrounding men suffering, and specifically so much of a lack of empathy when it's Black men who are being tortured? It's as though our bodies don't count. They're there for entertainment purposes.
Well, and that's really what it is Black men are disposable. So it's okay that it happened, because at the end of the day, not only are Black men really not to be entertained as human, fundamentally, we've been raised in a culture that has designated Black women as being worth more. So in other words, especially, you know, when you talk about Generation X, the idea of Black men being lesser beings was very much a reality in terms of how we're perceived and treated, right? There have been recent cases that have come out of violence toward men. And it's not so much that people are laughing about it now, but people look at it and experience a kind of cognitive dissonance. They don't know where to go with it, so they move on. So I've shown this on my show, right? The case where the woman ran over her husband because he no longer wanted to see other women, or the case where you had the woman that shot her man who walked in on her cheating, and the reason she shot him wasn't because he did anything, but because he started to leave. He was packing a bag. She shot him. Right? There's another woman that shot her man because he refused to argue with her. Right? Even celebrities like Tamar Braxton and I'm blanking on Biggie Smalls' ex-wife. I just posted an article about her abusing her husband. Right? So, but and the idea,
Faith Evans, I believe.
Faith, thank you. Yeah. And the idea was that, well, you know, and this is where you'll hear people, well, they were probably, they were probably cheating on them. And my question is always like, that's interesting that abuse and murder are somehow justifiable if men are cheating. It's actually viewed by many women as an acceptable rationale. But the question always falls apart when I reverse it. I'm like, okay, so is it justifiable for a man to shoot his wife in the head if he catches her cheating? Then all of a sudden you see all of the kind of values kick in, like, no, she should never be treated like that. But you have nothing to say about these men that are dying arbitrarily or being abused arbitrarily because she thinks he's doing something. But I don't care if he's holding orgies in the middle of the house. If there's no justification for abusing another human being, especially if they're female, why should there be justification if they're male? You know, abuse is abuse. But strangely enough, we don't hold that view.
And I guess we can speculate as to why, but I think you already stated Black men don't have value in this country, or Black women are deemed more valuable in this country. Doc, you talked earlier about your Black male studies classes, and I've heard one of your podcasts where you mentioned that there are a lot of women who are not Black, Latina, Asian, white, who take your class, and you've seen an uptick in that. Can you please kind of elaborate that more? And I may have a few follow-up questions.
Sure. Kevin Samuels has quoted me on that. That came from an interview I did probably like 4 years ago with Obsidian. And we were talking about the composition. Right. We were talking about the composition of my classes. And at the time, I was noticing that I had this influx of young white women who were taking my classes. And I wasn't saying that they were in the majority. The majority, up until I would say very recently, have been Black. But I started to see more and more. What I actually said was they were performing at the highest levels. They were getting A+. I mean A+. They were answering every question. They'd done every reading assignment. You know, usually I got to kind of pull my students back and forth to do the reading. They're asking for more readings. And when I started to pull them aside individually, just in a very casual manner, and just, kind of casually talking to them, really, I was trying to find out why they were taking the class, because I'd never seen them. For the most part, the most consistent answer was they were dating Black men, and they wanted to know about their man's culture. They wanted to be able to understand what the context was for what he was coming out of. Now, I will say that Fresno State is now considered, especially in Central California, a Hispanic serving institution. So the numbers have shifted. Now it's not white women who are taking my class and performing at the best level. I'm finding more and more Latina women who are taking my classes in greater numbers and performing better across the board. And many of them are doing it for the same reasons white women did. So it's one class. I'm not at all arguing that this is something that I can verify across the country. I'm just saying, from my humble observations of the students in my classroom, and even now on Zoom, since that's what we're doing now, I've been sitting here all day teaching, it's majority Latina, and they're not playing.
Can you explain to us, and again, it's a privilege and an honor to have you here, Dr. Johnson, because just to be able to sit, I learn from you, I think I know everybody here learns from you. The audience is just very appreciative. And I'm going to ask you, what do you think is the reason why, I guess, Black men have become so popular with women of other ethnicities? Like, what's going on?
Well, when you look at some of the data about it, we tend to be the fathers that spend the most time with our children. We tend to be the most progressive out of different groups of men. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that you're talking about men who were raised in a community, again, led by women. You know what I mean? At the end of the day, that's one of the most consistent factors. And I always kind of, find it interesting when I hear feminists say things like, well, men or Black men can't take female leadership. And I'm like, Black men have been taking female leadership their entire life. Right. You know what I mean? And matter of fact, when you factor in that there are 20,000 more Black female faculty than male, across the country in terms of higher education, when you step on a college campus, it's overwhelmingly female across race. But even when you get into the Black sector or Black studies, it's still overwhelmingly female. So let's put that into context. As a child, we're raised in homes that are predominantly female, right? I already pointed out nearly 80%. And then you go to school. Well, over 90% of the teachers are female across race, right? So then if you're lucky enough to be a Black male that's not been relegated into special ed and routed out of school, if you manage to know how to code switch enough to make white teachers feel comfortable with you being there to the point where they'll pass you onward and you're able to go to college, the majority of your teachers there are female. So when this whole idea that men, particularly Black men, can't handle female leadership is ridiculous, because that's all we've ever known. That's the majority of the context, the social context that we've even grown up in, right? But I may be missing your question.
No. Well, you're talking about. We're talking about why is it that all of a sudden Black men have become so popular when we're vilified in the media, television. Mm-hmm. Our own women have, not all of our women, and shout out to the sisters that support the brothers. I love you guys.
Absolutely.
We support you 100%, but we do have a sickness in our culture that needs to be dispersed and dealt with. So we're talking about it. We're bringing light to it. But to you Black women who support your Black men, your sons, your fathers, your husbands, this conversation is not for you. For most part, this is a conversation with brothers so we can better understand ourselves and the society that we live in. It's very rarely that you get a highly educated, trained doctor like Dr. Johnson who teaches this, and someone like myself who can really get the questions answered in the shortest amount of time and really help you all. Doc, you can so basically you're saying we become popular, first of all, because we're egalitarian, we take good care of our children. Mm-hmm. But it seems as though our own sisters, not all, they have such horrible things to say about us. Mm-hmm. Why do you think that is? And why wouldn't our own sisters be willing to compete for us against these other women and get the best of us back? Because the common trope is that the richest of us, the most successful of us, marry outside of race. Maybe you want to tackle that? I know it's a lot in there, but you can. Appreciate it.
You don't compete for beings that you think you're owed and beings that you think or you've been socialized to believe are lesser than you. When you at the end of the day, you don't do that. So I think when it comes to the perception of Black men and intergenerationally, the idea that we're lesser beings contributes to that. Now, as far as other women, they're seeing and engaging Black men who are very strong, very enterprising, even educated, so on and so forth. But they're engaging you without that socialization that somehow you're lesser being, or I should say, it's still there, at least in regard to racism, but not as doubly embedded as you find in our own community, where you have this Black male failure kind of perspective that takes place. And part of that is rooted in a treatment of Black male, particularly, again, going back to the 60s and 70s, that offered them less opportunity. And with less opportunity, it meant that it was more difficult to compete. But here's the thing. The standards and ideas that many of our women were able to develop because they were able to enter into corporate America, they were able to be more readily employed on a consistent basis across the board. Even, so whether they had welfare and didn't work, or whether they were able to go to school and get jobs, there was at least a glass floor. That floor didn't really exist for Black men. So we were competing with ideas and experiences that many of us didn't have. So when you look at the impact of, say, affirmative action on hiring, there was a double minority benefit that many women got, and they were able to exist in spaces that many Black men had never stepped foot in. So now you start to see the kind of, and I know you grew up in the same time period I did in the 1980s, right? And in the 1980s, you started to hear this language about a list, right? Where he needed to be over 6 feet tall. He needed to make six figures, right? He needed to be able to do all these kind of things. He had to have a certain type of penis length. He had to carry himself in the boardroom and in the streets. He had all these lists of expectations regarding Black men. But much of that list began to be influenced by these corporate experiences. So even when you say six figures, that alone eliminates the overwhelming majority of Black men off a list. As soon as you say six figures, I mean, to this day, to earn six figures, you're talking about roughly 9% of all men. Right. And by the time you get to Black men, you're down to like 3% that earn six figures. I mean, when you look at it, when you control for it by household, what we see in Black communities, not just the men, in communities, 40% of us we living off of less than 21,000, right? 60% less than 38,000, and that's multiple incomes by household before taxes. So by the time you get to individual Black men, the overwhelming majority of us have no inherited wealth, which is where the majority of wealth comes from in families. It's inherited. We generally don't have it. Many of us are either dealing with it on income in terms of jobs or in terms of businesses we're starting. So with these kinds of new experiences, many Black women got to experience a realm that most Black men didn't, especially going up through the 1990s and early 2000s. And that being an expectation and a measure of our desirability, our ability to be the quote unquote man in terms of how it's interpreted. A lot of that many Black men could not live up to. Meanwhile, you have other groups of women that are more flexible in terms of what they're looking for, and they found many Black men to be compatible in that to that degree, because they weren't as rigid about what that is. And I'll tell you what I mean. So I've been teaching for 22 years at the university level, and in the last 7 or so years, one of the things I often ask my students is, how much are Black men expected to earn to be considered worthy of dating, right? The majority of my male students will say that every, woman that they've dated up to that point has required six figures of them. Now, let me explain what that means. That means you got an 18-year-old young man sitting in a class who has dated the young lady sitting next to him, and she has required that he make six figures now at 18. That's the measure. Most men that make six figures don't even earn that till mid to late 30s, if not 40s, right? So that kind of expectation on young Black men in a community with very little wealth, these are the kind of things that really fractured a lot of the coupling between Black men and women, offset expectations that were not realistic. And that's one of the things that continues to plague us to this day.
And Doc, I don't think it just comes from the women, because I'm gonna tell you, I have a story I share and I talk about it in my book, Rules to Live By. I was 18. I just graduated. My adopted father told me I needed to make some money so I can go to college. I'd already been accepted. I'd already won. Yeah, that's it. Yes,
This what you were talking about?
that's the one right there, man.
Oh my goodness. Okay, that's you. Oh my.
That's me, man. Yeah. In chapter 1, I talk about how, so much pressure being put on me to make this money that, and I'm in the hood. I talked to one of my homeboys who was a dope dealer. He was a little younger than me. So he said, well, man, just come with me. You can ride with me. We can do this, make this, and then I'll give you some of it, and hopefully that'll help you out. You see? So we start riding down Normandy Avenue. I picked him up, and we were going to apparently go to this spot and sell what was called cook up. Cook up is not even crack. It's like the residue that comes off the glass. And so we're going to roll it up, recook it, and we're going to sell it and leave. So we were going to bum rush somebody's spot, sell it to some crackheads, right, and then leave. Man, about halfway through the trip, I just said, man, I can't do this. I didn't want to have that on my soul. I didn't want to be part of the reason why, our people are destroyed. I didn't even that little part, even though it was for a good thing, I didn't want to do that. But I can imagine the pressure being put on Black men who are 18 years old. You got 19, 20, 21 with 2 children. You got your mother screaming at you about get out there and be a man. You got your baby mama saying, yeah, you know what? You did this. You need to do this. And then they go out and do drastic, crazy things. A vast majority of these violent crimes being committed by Black men, these breaking and entries, these robberies, they're committed during the holidays. They're committed during times when men are supposed to be men and come up with presents for women. If you do the research on it, that's what's going on. Our Black men trying to prove that they're men by doing things that are totally crazy because everybody's putting that pressure on.
No, absolutely. But don't forget the environment we're in, and I think some of what the story you talked about speaks to that, right? I mean, the environment we're in is high levels of unemployment. We're living in areas where even if you do go to school and you do follow the rules and you do get good grades, your school is not necessarily competitive. So you may not find yourself on a college track, even if you're able to finish with good grades. So you're in an environment where Black males are struggling to try and achieve something in an environment that doesn't have much. And then 2, when you look at poor people and the options they have, if they don't have wealth, one of the things that we start to do is we develop new wealth standards. And by that, I mean, we'll often exchange actual wealth for status symbols, right? So especially in terms of trying to garner respect in the areas we're in. So I may not be able to buy a house. I may not be able to have a savings account with a certain amount of money in it, but I can buy these Jordans. I can buy this car. And that's not to say that's the majority of where our resources are going. Actually, the majority of our resources are actually going to household needs and day-to-day needs. But you still do have this kind of status symbol system that we use often in exchange for the real measures of or metrics of wealth development, because we're coming out of an environment that leads to very little, especially for Black men. Black men are the ones that often find themselves in positions with the least amount of options. And so, yeah, it's not an accident that, as we start to see from the 1970s onward, right, job access declined dramatically. In the 70s, you had the deindustrialization, right? So where you had people working blue collar jobs. There was a time period where you could be a factory worker and you could own a house and pay your wife's way through college, you know what I mean, and have a car and so on and so forth. That reality by the end of the 1970s disappears. So in the last few years, in 35 major cities, Black men have been unemployed up to 40 and 50%, right? The jobs are not there. And then we hit COVID. And by February, March, Black America has lost half its employment. You know what I mean? But when you stack that onto what Black men have been going through, they've been, most radically unemployed for generations. And yet the expectations on us, even, and I agree with you, even by ourselves, by other men, and in expectations we individually have of ourselves, is often to achieve something that's ridiculous. But here's the other piece. It's the other piece is also media. Much of the media that caters to, as you said earlier, we consume more, but really, many of some of the data points to women consume far more than men. When it comes to targeting the Black community as far as media, the targeting point is never Black men. the targeting point is Black women because they spend more and they're more apt to be the ones to spend on whatever product or whatever you're selling. So that said, one of the things we see is this rush of films, this rush of media from the 1980s onward, from Oprah to Terry McMillan films to current day films like Girls Trip. You see this plethora of media representations of highly successful Black women tolerating and navigating Black men who can't keep up. Right. And so this kind of industry of being frustrated at Black men really starts to take off, and it's quite lucrative. Yeah. And it's targeted at the women mainly because the women spend more. So that's how that works. And we end up becoming the butt of the joke. So we're the abusers, we're the rapists, we're the infidelity, figure in the relationship. And all of that plays out in the drama of media because it's lucrative. What that's done, however, over the last 30 years is really, kind of frame these beliefs into something crystallized, meaning I can talk to a professor, who will talk about this and cite movies as her source for why Black men are not worthy partners.
Oh, wow.
Because that's been accepted. That's the accepted trope.
Wow. Doc, we only got about 15 minutes left, and it's amazing how quickly the time has gone by. I consider Dr. Johnson not just a friend, but also a colleague, but also a friend. And I invited him to actually speak to my sons one Saturday.
Man, that
it was after I had I had to show them what others thought about their father, just because I understand that Black boys oftentimes will pattern themselves after their father or think they can only rise as high as their fathers. You mentioned to me that oftentimes at the university, the first example of a man, a well-spoken, accomplished Black man is yourself. And you have these Black boys that you have to deal with. Tell us about that experience and tell us what you find in these young men who grew up without fathers and not knowing anything or not having strong male role models. And how does that happen in America?
I missed a portion of that. Can you say that again?
I remember in one of our conversations, you mentioned the fact that oftentimes when the boys get to college, they get to Fresno State. Mm-hmm. You're oftentimes the first Black male role model they have. How does that even happen in the United States?
Well, the numbers of Black faculty, particularly Black male faculty, has never been extensively high. If you look at tenured Black male faculty across the country, is somewhere between 4,000 and 6,000. So to be a tenured professor as a Black male that's what we're looking at across the entire country. So that's a ridiculously small number. So that said, it's not surprising when it happens. The hard part that I find in terms of dealing with my young men here, really at every university I've been with, but especially at the state level, is because many of them are first generation. They're the first ones in their families to still go to college. And I remember, that was the kind of thing I heard most from Black males when I was in undergrad, and I'm still hearing it. They're the first generation to go. But here's the kind of problem that comes with it. Here in California, right, the literacy rate, the illiteracy rate for Black boys is about 70%. Right, 70% of Black boys in K through 12 in California are not functionally literate in terms of their level. Right, 70% in the California State University system, which is the system I teach for, and it's the largest university system in the country. 70% of Black men in their first year of college drop out here in California, in California State Universities. Right, 70% drop out in their first year. So 70% are illiterate in K through 12, and 70% drop out their first year from the largest university system in the country. And that doesn't include the fact that one of the things I did in my last show is I was talking about some of the data that speaks to Black boys nationally. By 8th grade, only about 10% are literate. Now, when you want to talk about STEM jobs, when you want to talk, science, math, engineering, you want to talk about law, you want to talk about being a teacher, all of this requires reading. Reading is the fundamental aspect to it. Even math and science still go back to reading and reading comprehension. But if black males are not really being educated, not really being taught how to read, especially if they're pushed off into special ed, we are already out of the economy by the time we're in third grade. My son, who's 15 and 6'6", right? I just sent him to the store, so he came home while we started this interview, and I was kind of had to breathe because you never know what happens when you send your boys out. But my son, by the second week of kindergarten, they tried to put him into special ed. And when I refused to let them, by second grade, he's reading 700-page Harry Potter books by himself. He's the top 2 performing in his class all the way through 6th grade. But had I not fought for that, he would have been in special ed. And he's still an A student. He's got a 3.7 GPA. But again, without that kind of support, these institutions are ready to send our males, most especially. Because remember, when it comes to the girls, they're actually the demographic considered, they are the demographic most highly enrolled in higher education. But somehow the boys are functionally illiterate across the country and nobody is saying a word. So when I talk about black male disposability, when I talk about the perception that black males are less than their female counterparts, I know that sounds like hyperbole. I know you want to label me a certain way, but when you look at the data and you see where things are, I mean, let me just ask you, have you heard a national campaign of black folk tearing stuff down because their sons can't read?
No, not at all.
I haven't either.
And I find it amazing that we can have children, different sexes in the same household, and one group can be considered the most educated and have the most degrees in the United States, and the other the most illiterate. How does that happen except for intentional disregard for their well-being? Mm-hmm. And I just find that unfathomable in this day and age that we would neglect our black sons like that. Mm-hmm. and there's no outcry because of that.
And I've tried to explain that to people, and people say that I'm exaggerating. It's not that serious. And I say, look, imagine a world where you woke up tomorrow and even just in our community, our girls were illiterate up to rates of 70%. What would happen?
Oh, it would be toxic masculinity. We got to get rid of this. There'd be marches. There'd be Save Our Girls. Michelle Obama would get on TV and say, this has got to stop. This is an injustice. Barack Obama would come out and say, we have to do something about it. Even the Republicans would come in and say, oh, well, yeah, this is a travesty. But I mean, everybody would be for that, righting that wrong.
And this is why Jim Sedanius' work with social dominance theory, subordinate male target hypothesis, his work argued, back in the late 80s that it's the males that are particularly targeted. So when you had oh my goodness, it's been a long day. When you had intersectionality introduced, and the concept basically argued that black women were the most oppressed group, most particularly by race, class, sex, and gender, and that black males were just underneath them, but because they were privileged by gender, they weren't as oppressed enough. Jim Sedanius' work showed the exact opposite, that in fact, it's actually the males that are hyper targeted by the group that is actually doing the oppressing. And we've seen that empirically framed, but for some reason, intersectionality doesn't require any empirical data. So we just kept getting told that black women were the most oppressed, despite what the data said, despite what our lived experiences said, and we accepted it at face value. And now we go, and since then we've been going around and going around checking black men's privilege. It's a ridiculous concept. But at the end of the day, the reality is that it's the black males that are targeted.
The privilege of being followed by the police and beaten, the privilege of being the most incarcerated group of minority men in the country, the privilege of being undereducated, raped, castrated, beaten, all for the past 4 centuries since we've been in this country. What other privilege? The privilege of being undereducated, abused in our homes, abandoned by our own people. This is the privilege that black males have.
Well, and I've heard academics that will tell you that we're privileged because there are a select few that are able to go from college ball to pro ball.
Yes,
which is an infinitesimal fraction. If you think about a sport, like football or basketball, what age do your boys start training to play? Like in your 2nd, 3rd, 4th grade?
Right.
What percentage of them make it to college, and then what percentage of them make it to the pros? And it's an infinitesimal percentage. But when you factor on top of that, they have a shelf life of 3 to 5 years, and the majority make six figures, not seven or eight. They make six figures for 3 to 5 years for something they've been training their entire life for. And that's considered a privilege, especially during college, where they're not allowed to secure any kind of income from their sport, but the universities they play for do. But that's a privilege. The other privilege I've heard them point to is that we die and get recognition for our deaths, and that's a privilege.
Oh, wow.
So,
what a privilege.
Especially by the hands of vigilantes and police officers, that's our privilege. That's our privilege. Our name. But what people don't recognize is that, look, when you look at black males, we die. There's about 200 to 300 of us that die every year to police homicide. There's about 9 to 13 black women. The percentages for LGBT are roughly around 4%, according to a UCLA report. So it's heterosexual black males that are dying in the highest numbers, even by our own hands in our own communities, going back to those environmental causes, right? But at the end of the day, the privilege that's recognized in academia for black males is that our names are mentioned when we die.
We get a shout out.
We get a shout out.
Yeah.
But here's the twist. So if I tell you 2 to 4% of breast cancer victims, breast cancer, people with breast cancer in the black community are male, would you then regard breast cancer as a male issue?
No.
Particularly a primarily male issue? Not at all.
No. That'd be an infinitesimal amount, not enough, insignificant. Why are we even talking about it? Let's move on to something serious.
Right. If we talk about single parenthood, does anybody look at black males? Or males for that matter, across race? Does anybody designate men as the face of single parenthood?
It's a fluke. If there are any, it's a fluke.
Absolutely.
Right.
But when it comes to issues that have political equity, issues that can be used to advance policy or at the least advance people's political careers, then there's contestation over who black deaths should be owned by and who those black deaths should work for. And this ironic thing is they don't work for black men who are dying. Those are the ones dying. They don't work for us. They work for other demographics that use those deaths for their own agendas. But we can't get policy passed on stemming our own deaths. But we have privilege because our names are mentioned when we die on camera, mind you. That's the thing. Since 1992, it's black men dying on camera that's gotten the attention. And of course, the numbers we die in.
Doc, we only have about another 5 minutes. Man, we've just run through this time. I don't want to hold you all night. I know you've had a long day, but if you all appreciate this level of scholarship and having folks like Dr. T. Hasan Johnson here, you should first of all contribute, donate, share, like, and then also find him on YouTube. Doc, if you will take the last few minutes, please, just to try to tell us where we can find you on YouTube. Tell us any of books that you've written, any scholarship, anything that you have that people who are now hungry for what you do and what you've spoken about, where they can investigate more or do their own research or follow your research. If you can, just take your time and tell us where we can find you.
Find me on Facebook at T. Hasan Johnson. On Twitter, I'm at Lord Hasan. And I made that during my ode to hip hop days and Lord Jamar. Anyway, you can also find me mostly on YouTube. Look for Dr. T. Hasan Johnson. You can find the Onyx Report, which is my show, which is every Wednesday at 5 p.m. Pacific. And we generally, so I'm doing that, once a week at this point. I also have a film review series that's designed for fathers who are talking to their sons and using film to bond through and pass on life lessons. So I do film reviews. You can find that through my Patreon account. So again, you can look up, my Patreon link, and all of my videos have it in the description. So you can go to that and contribute. I'm going to be doing Birth of a Nation this week. And I also have a blog at newblackmasculinities.wordpress.com, and you can find some of my pieces there. But the majority of my work these days is on my YouTube channel, The Onyx Report. And I think that's where you'll find some recent stuff. And tomorrow night, we're going to be covering black male archetypes. So check us out.
All right, Doc. And I appreciate that. And remember what I told you, right? I told you that I need you to get on that plane take that trip with me, hang out with me, either in the DR or in Colombia, so I can show you how it feels to be treated well. And then you can go and write a thesis paper on that. Well, being appreciated as opposed to tolerated. Now, I'm going to make an announcement to the world here. We breaking news that the people's lawyer has a lovely lady in my life that's probably going to end up being my wife.
What? All right.
How it happened. It happened all of a sudden. And so I'm on a short leash now. Okay, my leash, all that stuff you was talking about, black men I'm being leashed up now, brother. I'm proud to say that she's a beautiful Afro-Latina.
All right.
Looked for and treated well. And I want to share this with you. You know, you're my friend. Go ahead and piss all the rest of them off now.
No, all of that, just to let people know, all of that came out of a discussion where, in other discussions, I was telling black men the expectation that we make six figures and all that stuff on the list we talked about.
Yeah.
When it happens, what you find is people move the goalpost.
Yeah, man.
When you achieve it, it's still not good enough. And you're still not able to secure the basic respect that other groups of men are able to get, even when they earn far less. So, once you reach that point, it causes a mass shift in how you conceptualize all of this.
And it goes to your point that they think less of us, so they make us do more so that we can then be qualified to be with them. Because see, if it was a Brad or somebody else, he doesn't have to. He can work in a mechanic shop.
Right.
Something about his whiteness and his blue-eyedness or whatever color his eyes is compensates for his lack of financial well-being. But a black man, if he's missing any of those qualities, if he's anything less than Superman, then you're gonna feel a lot of complaints. But thanks, Doc, man. I appreciate you having, man. We are already 1 or 2 minutes over. This time just blew by.
Yeah.
I thank you for coming. I certainly appreciate your scholarship and your thoughtful, well thought out concepts that you've elaborated here. Thank you so much. I know everybody in the audience appreciates you. Please, you have an open invitation to come back. We'll be checking out the Onyx Report on Wednesday, tomorrow. And thank you again, Doc. I appreciate you, man.
Oh, man. Thank you. And congratulations, brother.
I know, man. It shocked me too, bro, because, plain to see, you can't change me. I'm going to be a player for life. And now here I am getting ready to eat some mango and just go upstairs and be quiet, brothers. I don't know how it happened. I don't know. You got me.
So does that mean the guided tour? Does that mean the guided tour trips are over?
Pretty much, brother. But I can point you in the right direction. Remember, I'm not a leader. I am a pathfinder, but we'll be getting married in the Dominican Republic at some point.
What?
I'll keep you posted.
Yes.
We're breaking news tonight. Uncle D is getting locked down. I'm back on the plantation. Kind of. A different plantation where they speak Spanish. Amen. Anyway, bro, you be cool, man. We out, man. Thanks, Doc.
You too, man. Peace.
All right, everybody. We out of here.